Welcome to the Moved to Meditate podcast. I'm your host, Addie D. Hilster. If you're a yoga practitioner or teacher who knows that there's more to yoga than poses, but you're wondering where to find that, come join our quiet little party. Here you'll find resources to help you deepen your practice, as well as insightful conversations with yoga, movement, and meditation teachers from a range of traditions. On this podcast, we spotlight the more contemplative aspects of movement practice. So we talk about all things gentle yoga, meditation, yin, restorative, yoga therapy, mindfulness, and more. Listen in and connect to a community of like-minded practitioners. Happy New Year, everyone. That's assuming that you're listening to this around the time that it's coming out at the beginning of 2022. But whenever you are in time and space, I hope that you're doing well. We have a great episode today with Nyk Danu, who is an experienced Yin Yoga teacher who's really knowledgeable about both yoga therapy and Chinese medicine. So we really geeked out together in this conversation, and this one is for our Yin lovers. I hope you'll enjoy it. And in the meantime, I'll just mention what's going on a little bit around Moved to Meditate. And currently in January 2022, we've just started looking at a new deeper dive theme of patience and persistence. Last week's podcast was on the topic. It was the intro to this topic of patience and persistence. So I highly recommend listening back to that one if you haven't yet. For some insights on these two really important qualities that can help us with our goals and intentions, if it's New Year's, or really at any time with just navigating life, as complicated as it is for all of us. I think patience and persistence really helpful. And I talk about some of the pitfalls and misunderstandings around what patience is and how it gets confused with being passive, and with what persistence looks like and how that can turn into forcing and being aggressive, and how holding the two qualities together is really the key. So give that a listen if you haven't already. And if you're on my email list, you should be getting the deeper dive worksheet on patience and persistence this week, like the week this podcast is coming out, beginning of January. So you can do some reflection with it on your own. If you missed it, if this is some other time and you've missed the worksheet but you do want it, that's totally cool. Just email me at mail@movedtomeditate.com, M-A-I-L, mail@movedtomeditate.com, and I'll be happy to send you the worksheet and put you on the list for future ones, even if this is quite a while later. Totally fine. Just give me a little buzz. Okay, so onward. Let's hear this week's conversation. Okay, hello everybody. So today I'm really excited. We're going to be talking with Nyk Danu, who is a yoga therapist and yin yoga teacher and trainer and yoga business mentor. And she's based in Vancouver Island, Victoria and Vancouver Island. So we're kind of broadcasting to you from two different Vancouvers today. Since I'm in Vancouver, Washington, it's kind of fun. I think Nyk and I have crossed paths on Instagram and online for a while, and I know I've been following your work for quite a while. I think we have a lot in common, so I'm really excited to talk to you more today about how yin yoga can be therapeutic and how yoga therapy fits in with this yin yoga practice. Nyk has also done a lot of training in Chinese medicine studies, like 2,000 hours or something like that. So I'm really excited to hear the perspective that Nyk will bring to this conversation. So why don't we jump in, Nyk? Would you like to tell us a little bit more about your background and teaching and whatever you might want us to know going in?
Sure. So I came to yoga. I won't talk about my whole yoga journey, just from where I decided to be a teacher. So I was a hairstylist and a platform artist, which means I traveled around and taught hair, essentially.
Cool.
Before this, I taught advanced hair color technique. Yeah. So I did a lot of hair shows and workshops and classes and things, and traveled across the country doing that. and had been practicing yoga for probably about 5 or 6 years at that point, and was starting to have some work-related injuries. And it became very apparent that coming up with a plan B while I still had plan A would be a good idea. And so I racked my brains and thought, what in the world could I do? Because I had been spoiled and had always done what I loved from the time I left high school. It was really important to me to keep doing that. And so since I didn't think anyone was going to pay me to work in a coffee shop and read books, yoga became pretty clear, because I thought, I've already loved yoga. I've been practicing yoga. It's helped me so much with some of my own mental, emotional, and physical issues and injuries. And I'm already a teacher, so it just made sense. So my first teacher training was a 300-hour, and it was a Iyengar based, but not an Iyengar certification program. So big focus on alignment. And then I graduated that in 2004. And then I met Paul Grilley via DVD first, back when everyone had DVDs.
Totally.
I found it in a bookstore, and I bought it because I really felt like my training didn't have enough on anatomy. So I thought, well, this will be a good resource. And I watched it, and it completely blew my mind. Just seeing the amount of skeletal variations that there were. And also it explains so many things in my own body that when I was in my Iyengar courses and trainings and would ask them about, I would never get a good answer. Like I would always get an answer where it's like, that doesn't make any sense. And so I started, I watched that DVD, and then a couple of years later, I think it was 2007, I just happened to walk into a yoga studio to buy a bolster. It was a studio I never went to, random. And there was a picture of Paul Grilley on a poster saying that he was coming to do a yin yoga workshop. I thought, that's the guy from my DVD. I didn't even know what yin yoga was. I had zero knowledge of it. I just knew that he was coming and his work had changed my life. So of course I was signing up for this workshop. And so I did. I had never heard of yin, hadn't done yin. And needless to say, it was challenging, I think anyone who has tried yin, especially the first couple times, realizes that although it's often mistaken for like an easy, gentle practice, air quotes, it can be quite challenging mentally and emotionally. And, so I did go through all of that, of course. But I had a meditation practice. So this whole monkey mind thing wasn't that unfamiliar. And I remember thinking after the first day, oh my God, I'm going to be so sore tomorrow, because I'd never held things in a passive way for that long. And I was not sore. In fact, I felt amazing. There had never been such a sense of fluidity and spaciousness in my body before. And so I did the next 2 days of the workshop, and I was completely hooked from there. So I bought his DVD and his book, and, started just adding that to my regular hatha practice a couple times a week. But I still wasn't really teaching it. Finally, I started dabbling in teaching it here and there. Even before I went to study with him, if I had, for example, a class where I was sick and had to show up to teach, this is pre-COVID times when nobody rested and everyone just did everything while they were sick.
Yeah, totally.
Yes. Or if it was like the last class before Christmas or something and everyone was just like exhausted, I would be like, okay, let's do a yin practice today. And then fast forward a couple more years, and I was blessed to get a tiny bit of money from family. And I always believe if you get spontaneous money, you should do something that you really want to do, but probably couldn't have done on your own with it. And so I signed up for my first of now 5 visits to California to go study with Paul Grilley. So I did my first 100 hours, and it's since been back 5 times. And as soon as the world becomes normal again, hope to go back once again.
That's amazing.
So I have a 500-hour with Paul Grilley, and he and his wife Susie are still what I would consider true teachers to me. I do not use that word lightly. In fact, I'm very skeptical and kind of standoffish when it comes to teachers, just because we've seen so many of them blow up in the yoga world.
Yeah,
so I'm always very hesitant to join. But I have the utmost respect for both of them, and I do consider them true teachers. So as soon as I can get back, I'll do it again. I'll do more training. And then I wanted to move. I've always wanted to study Chinese medicine deeper
Mm-hmm.
because it was so healing in my own body. I kept going to doctors with symptoms and they were like, all your tests show you're within the range of normal. And like nobody would give me any answers. And meanwhile, I was exhausted and all of the things still. And so I couldn't figure it out. I went actually to an acupuncturist because my chiropractor recommended it for musculoskeletal stuff. And when I met with her and told her all of my symptoms, and she said, and I said, doctors can't figure this out. And she said, oh, it's interesting because in Chinese medicine, that's all the same thing. And I was like, say what? And so I started seeing her regularly and was blown away by the medicine and how therapeutic it had been. And that was one part of wanting to study Chinese medicine. And then the other part of it was that I really wanted to learn more about this yin business of yin yoga.
Yeah.
And although Paul goes over, I don't know what his trainings are going to be in the future, of course, but the ones that I took, he does go over the meridians, but it's quite brief because he also combines it with chakras. And so I didn't really get to like deep dive into it. And so when I decided that I was going to move, and thereby would not have any clients, I wanted to study it when I was still in Calgary, but nobody would let you audit the Chinese medicine courses, nor would they let you go part-time. And I already had a full, very abundant teaching career. And it just felt like that's way too much of a sacrifice if I'm not 100% sure this is my path. So I never did. But when I decided to move to Victoria on Vancouver Island and realized that I would have no clients and, I'd be starting from scratch again, I thought, well, if there's ever a good time to go back to school, now's the time. Well. Yeah. So I registered for the full Chinese medicine doctorate program and realized about 2.5 to almost 3 years in that actually I wasn't excited about putting needles in people. It didn't gross me out. It didn't scare me. It just left me with kind of,
yeah.
And since I already had a career I was super passionate about, and, I'm in my late 40s, I was not going to spend more money and time on meh. So I took all of the Chinese medicine courses that you can up to the courses where you're required to needle. And then I stopped my training and actually finished my yoga therapy certification as well. So it's kind of an interesting blend of like Chinese medicine theory and yoga therapy, but that's kind of where I sit now.
Yeah, I relate to so many things that you have pointed out on your path. And it's interesting, like the last thing you said about the blend of yoga therapy and Chinese medicine, because in yoga therapy, they tend to refer to Ayurveda a lot more, and which is like traditional Indian medicine. And I have always resonated quite a bit more myself with the Chinese medicine side of things. And so combining that with yoga and some elements of Indian yoga and then the Taoist aspects and the Buddhist aspects as well. It's one of the really appealing things to me about Yin Yoga and the way that it brings these different elements together skillfully. So I think that's pretty cool. And it's so interesting to me how you dove into your studies with Paul Grilley after having your eyes opened to the anatomy aspect. Can you talk a little bit more about what skeletal variation is? This is something that I think is a huge contribution of Paul's, and it would be really worth highlighting and kind of bringing that forward as an aspect of yin yoga that can really be useful in any kind of yoga.
I'll use my own body as an example. So for those of you who haven't heard of skeletal variations before, basically the premise is that we all have different bones. Just like we all have different hair colors, eye colors, skin colors, body proportions, et cetera, et cetera. We all take that for granted. We assume, yes, of course, we all look different on the outside. But for some reason in yoga trainings, we're not taught that actually we also all look different on the inside. So our bones are not the same. And for my body, I'm an internal rotator in the hips. So what that means in layman's terms is that the socket for where my leg bone plugs into my hip is actually a little bit more forward than the average bear. Apparently, internal rotation is a little bit more rare than external. I don't know the stats on that. And so, generally speaking, the directions that would be given in a yoga class for what to do with your feet in poses always felt the opposite to me, because they were giving a general direction for somebody who is more externally rotated or perhaps neutral. So I would get directions in yoga classes and I would follow them, but they would feel exactly the opposite in my body of what they said they should. And when I would ask them about it, I would get answers like, oh, it's because your hips are tight, which is ridiculous, because actually any other flexibility that I have, I've earned with years of practice, but my hips have always been open. So not only do I have a little bit more of a forward placement of the hole on your pelvis where your leg bone plugs in, but it's also fairly large. So I also have a really good degree of external rotation as well, depending on what position my pelvis is in. So this is why it was a bit of a mystery, because in some poses, you'd see that I have great external rotation, and then in others, I'd get stuck. And it all depends on where my pelvis is in space. And so it was frustrating, to say the least. Another example in my own body is that I have very limited range of motion to bring my arms back behind me before I hit my acromion process. Like it's tiny, tiny amount before I'm like, oh, and there's my bones. And so for years, I struggled with shoulder stand, thinking that, you know, practice, and all is coming. I thought it was my shoulder muscles, right? It's like one day these delts will open and I'll be able to get my arms back and lift my body weight.
And no matter how much you stretch.
Totally. Turns out, no, that will never happen. And then the other thing that I learned was that I also do not have a large range of motion to bring my chin towards my chest. So in shoulder stand, if you can't use your arms to lift your weight off of your neck, and you don't have a very long neck or very good ability to tuck your chin, it essentially means all your body weight's on C7. So no wonder I hated it.
Painful.
And once I studied with Paul and realized that, like, oh, the reason I can't do these poses well isn't because my muscles are tight. Because you can, with some help perhaps from a skillful teacher, if you've never done this before, you can actually feel the difference between I'm being restricted because of tight tissues and nope, I'm just not able to move and I don't know why. I'm not feeling anything. I just feel stuck.
Yeah.
And so I felt that in a few poses. And that's really what Paul helped me to figure out about my own body. And then, of course, through that, when I went back to go then look at my students' bodies, I was like, Eureka, I understand why I can say the same direction and none of you understand it in your bodies the same way, because we're not clones of each other. So yeah, if somebody has not heard of Paul's work with that and that DVD, Anatomy for Yoga, I cannot recommend it enough. It's actually the only required textbook, air quotes, for my teacher training. I make everybody has to watch all 5 hours of it and answer some reflection questions before we even get started, because I think it's not only is it so important for understanding yin, you know, because we don't focus on alignment in yin. And if you don't understand why, then you're just going to keep bumping up against that. Yeah. But I think it's important for all styles of yoga. If you just realize that, like, nobody's going to look the same in your class. And I actually personally think that's something to be celebrated, not, you know, I don't think we should be all pushed into a box and try to look the same.
I totally agree. And I had a similar experience when I did my yin yoga training with Bernie Clark in Vancouver, the other Vancouver. He was showing slides of people doing poses, and he was showing this slide of like a man doing a down dog, and this man's weight was like very forward into his arms and shoulders. And Bernie was talking about, like, you know, the typical adjustment that a teacher might make would be to like come up and push back on his pelvis to like take his weight back towards his heels. But then he like zoomed in on the shoulder joint and showed that, you know, because of the bony stop, like the limitation where this man's shoulder bones touch each other, like his arms could not be in that degree of flexion that would be required to have his weight shift back like that. And so like literally his hands would come off the ground if you pushed back, and, you know, teacher might be standing there going, what's happening? And the person in the pose is like, ow. And I just remember the light bulb going off and this feeling of compassion, like, oh my gosh, like the struggle for, a student who's being kind of like forced into this idea of alignment by someone who doesn't understand their body and doesn't understand that skeletons are different. So that was very eye-opening for me as well.
Yeah. And I mean, in that situation, we would be lucky if all that happened is that his hands lifted off the floor.
Yeah.
If we were pushing on him, right? I mean,
That hard, yeah.
that could get
Yeah.
really, yeah. And I remember being in so many classes where we would be in hero, going into reclined hero, or
Oh, yeah.
yin saddle, where, because I'm an internal rotator, it's easy for me to sit between my feet, but of course my knees are going to turn in because that's actually coming from my hip socket.
Yeah.
And the Iyengar camp just freaking out about that, thinking I was trashing my knees. So they would make me sit on so much height to keep my knees straight, that then when I laid back, I wasn't getting any stretch in my quads.
So it's just not even effective.
Right. So, and we're doing this as prep for a backbend workshop. So I'm like,
Yeah.
okay, but everybody else is now like releasing and stretching their quads, and I'm hanging out in a restorative pose. And you're going to ask me to do wheel at the end of this also,
Yeah.
And yeah, so it just, I think with that style, they're just, well, I actually just think in all styles pretty much, until Paul started talking about this, there just wasn't a big understanding of how skeletal variations can change everything in a pose.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It does change everything. And I think it calls into question some of those conventional ideas of where safety comes from. A lot of us thought for a long time that safety came from like getting the alignment right and the pose looking a certain way from the outside. And it's just not the case. When you start to see it from the inside out in this way and understand the skeletal variation as a starting point, and there are other factors as well, it just really calls that into question.
Yeah. I mean, I'm very grateful that I took that first 300 hours, because one thing that the Iyengar yogis are known for, well, there's a lot of things, but one thing that I especially appreciated was the ability to be a prop ninja or a prop queen.
Totally.
I mean, you learn all kinds of ways how to use blocks and bolsters and blankies and chairs and all the things. And as somebody who did not come from a flexible body, that was super important, I think, to learn. And it tends to be the thing when I mentor teachers, usually when they've gone through one of my trainings and then they want to do in-person mentorship, it's usually one of the things that they comment on is that I have an ability to look at people and just see when they're not comfortable, and somehow just know if I just put a block there or a blanket here, or if I just ask them to move their foot, and they're always like, how did you see that? I'm like, I don't know, I just do. But had I not been so well versed in props, I don't think that I would be the teacher that I am today. So I'm very grateful for that first style, but there was definitely one component of it that needed to go, and this was that one size fits nobody alignment cues.
Well, and this is really interesting in yin yoga world too, because there's certain camps in the yin world, or people who do yin yoga who think that props are not part of the practice. And Nyk just rolled her eyes. Sorry.
So much so they almost fell out of my head.
Yeah, and I'm the same. Like, I think props are very essential to the yin practice and the principles of yin practice. Like, first of all, holding the poses passively. Like, many times we can't even do that without a prop. So I agree with you. And I think this is part of what makes it a therapeutic practice, potentially a practice that meets us where we are, a practice that accommodates our bones and our joints. And it's just really funny that there is that misconception out there in some camps, and maybe less and less these days. I feel like I get less pushback on it than I used to, but so it's kind of funny. I don't know what you think about this, but I think there may be some disconnect where sometimes when we say, like, we're not using the props for aesthetic purposes to make people look a certain way, then people go, oh, okay, we don't need the props. Do you know what I mean? Like, there's, I think, a misunderstanding of the purpose of propping.
I also think that a lot of teachers out there, and maybe even seasoned practitioners think that as soon as you pull a yoga bolster off a shelf, suddenly you're doing restorative yoga.
Yeah.
And so I think that's part of the problem, is that people don't really understand restorative yoga in its true form. And so they don't really think that you can bring props into yin without making it restorative. And you absolutely can. To me, to say you shouldn't use props in a yin class, you're basically taking tickets at the door only for those people that are already flexible and have a large joint range of motion. So what you're doing is you're making the practice exclusive.
Yeah.
Not inclusive. So there are many, many bodies that cannot practice these poses without props, whether that's because of they don't have the flexibility yet, or whether it's because of their bone structure. Either one. To me, props are non-negotiable in my practice. I teach yin. That's sort of my specialty, but I'm a yoga therapist, so I help people with back pain and anxiety. And so we use props in those classes too. And those are also not restorative classes. So I think that if a teacher's listening to this and they think that when you pull a blanket or a bolster out, now it's a restorative class, they actually really need to study what is restorative yoga a little bit
that
more.
Too.
Because they are, although sometimes they can look similar-ish, maybe from the outside, they feel very different on the inside. And the props in a yin practice are not there to take all of the sensation away, unless of course someone's in pain, then it would be. They're there to get the person comfortable enough that they can actually be in the pose.
Right.
So it's a very different intention.
Because we want to be in the pose passively and for a length of time. And we can't do that. We can't stay in a pose without muscle engagement and active engagement if we are fighting it or we're not in a place that the body can rest. So, that's important. That's to me, that's where that misconception undermines the actual intention of a yin practice, and it becomes quite yang. It becomes something else. I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah. When people are sort of white knuckling it while they're in their pose, that's not yin.
Agreed. 100%. Yeah. So this also to me brings in the nervous system, because we're working with the nervous system when we practice, any kind of yoga, any kind of meditation, really anything we're doing throughout the day. Our nervous system has a role to play. And when we start to look at yin yoga through that lens, I also think the props are very important there, because how are we going to down regulate? How are we going to create a space for calm and contemplation if our nervous system is kind of firing because of how we're doing the pose? Can you speak a little bit to that, and to how you look at the role of the nervous system in a yin class?
Well, because I'm also a yoga therapist, which I'm sure you can relate. Once you see the world through that lens, you can't turn it off, regardless of what style of yoga you're teaching. It's like, this is always the way I see the world now. So for me, the nervous system is always a huge player in any class that I teach. I spend a lot of time at the start, nourishing the nervous system and really getting people to drop in and to ground before we even do any formal poses. But in yin, I think one of the reasons that it can have such a sweet effect on the nervous system, well, there's a few. One is the time in the poses. You get a chance to really kind of settle in and to ground before you're moving to something else. And for those like myself that tend to be anxious personality types, moving quickly from one thing to another can just aggravate, like a vata state, if you were speaking in Ayurvedic terms, right? Or a fire state. So if you are in a state of anxiety, which culturally most of us have been for the last 2 years,
if not longer.
Yeah, exactly. We were already anxious, and then and so whether you're just currently suffering from anxiety because the world is what it is right now, or whether you've always had anxiety, giving that time to really allow that deep grounding and to start to rest into something is super helpful. The deep fascia is also a nervous system conductor. It conducts for the nerves. So again, super helpful there. And then I think also quiet time. I mean, we're such a culture of being plugged in always, myself included. I'm not saying I have not mastered this, not an enlightened being by any means. But, you know, we always have computers and phones and like, so to just have like quiet time to be embodied, and to just notice how you feel, is super helpful for regulating our nervous system. One of the things that I notice, because when I do my classes, I always start with sort of an opening hello, where we all just go around and say our name and a word or a phrase to summarize how we're doing. And I often will take requests as well if people have areas they want to work on. One thing that I notice continually is that the first few people who get asked are like, how am I doing? Right? Like, how often do we sit still and just say, how am I feeling today? Mentally, emotionally, physically, before we decide what we're going to do with our day. And yin allows us a lot of time to really drop in and to notice and to witness how we're feeling, both physically, but also mentally and emotionally. And that to me, it can be really, really grounding. Also, the fact that you are on the floor. I mean, let's just start with being that simple.
Literally.
You were literally on the ground, which again has a soothing effect to the nervous system. Now, of course, you know, without diving down a big rabbit hole about trauma, every statement I just made assumes that somebody is, you know, got a typical amount of busyness of brain, maybe a little fidgetiness, but they're not in a PTSD, you know, flashback state. I mean, obviously, well, maybe not obviously, but obviously if somebody is experiencing the effects of working through their trauma in a yin class, then it will not be hanging out in their parasympathetic nervous system for them.
Right.
So that's a different situation. But for the most part, once people get over the fact that they're going to be there for a few minutes and they're going to have to be still and quiet, and I always talk about the role of the mind in my classes because I think it's kind of irresponsible, actually, if you have brand new yin students to just have them drop into a pose and not tell them, by the way, if you think and plan and list, write, and obsess here, welcome to the humanity, you know? So I always make sure to mention that, and I give them some specific anchors that they can use to bring their mind back to, but then of course allow for them to choose something else as well if they want to. So I think the quiet, being on the ground, the actually taking the time to practice interoception and awareness of what is happening inside of you. Even in other yoga classes, that can be sort of, interoception can be the afterthought, sort of like, and here's Shavasana, you know, which if it's not guided well, people just lay there and think. So not really interoception.
Very true.
But with yin, interoception is this awareness of the inner landscape is happening from the very beginning. When we're asking people to choose variations that are working for their body, that means they have to drop into their body and be like, okay, what am I feeling here? And so it just brings that back in over and over and over again in layers in the practice. And I think that is such a gift to the nervous system.
Absolutely. And it's so true what you're saying about, you know, yang, so to speak, yoga classes or faster paced or more active yoga classes. Because we're moving from pose to pose, we're focused a lot more on proprioception, like where the body is in space. Nothing wrong with that, but that's one of the benefits of yin, and what it gives us that's different is that time and stillness, and we don't have to be thinking about repositioning and where we are relative to the floor and the mat and the block and the things. You know, we can actually pause and feel inside and experience that inner awareness, you know, that interoception. So that's a beautiful thing. I'm glad you brought that in.
Beautiful, and it's what makes it difficult.
That's true. Yes.
So if somebody's used to a style of yoga where they're constantly hearing the teacher's voice, every breath or two, you know, put your foot here, extend here, do this, do that. It's a lot easier for people to stay focused when they have that external cueing. But in a yin class where they get into it and the teacher's got them in, and then hopefully if they're a skillful teacher, eventually they stop talking.
Give some space.
Then, yeah, give them some space to just be in the pose. Not that there shouldn't be a framework, and there is talking,
totally.
of course, but that can also make it more challenging, because now people actually realize, oh, if I don't have an external voice to focus on, and I'm just focusing inside, all of a sudden I realize that I'm super twitchy and I'm bored and I'm thinking, and or who knows, right? What could come up.
It's just like learning meditation. I mean, that's really what we're practicing in the space of a pose, is we're learning mindfulness, and we're learning how to sustain our own focus rather than have it be led step by step like it would be in a more active class. So that's where, you were talking about giving people some anchors that they can choose from. This is just like teaching meditation.
And the nice thing about yin is that I do believe it's the gateway drug to meditation.
Yeah.
Because
totally.
they're in it, they focus for about, 5 minutes, probably at the most, in the average drop-in class.
Mm-hmm.
And then, then they're having to like do a new pose, and then they kind of drop in. And so it's like bite-sized meditations. I often tease my students and say, one of the biggest misconceptions out there is I can't meditate because my mind's too busy. Well, welcome to being human. Like, nobody, unless they're already enlightened beings, sits down on the cushion or on the yin yoga mat and just clears their mind, and everything just comes out. Like, that doesn't happen. I wish somebody would have told me that when I started meditating, because which is why I discuss the role of the mind so much in my yin classes. Because I thought I was in, beginner meditation series, like a 6-week series, an 8-week series. And I thought that everybody else was completely blissed out, and I was the only one with the circus going on in my mind. And it wasn't until I found my last teacher, and he said in like week 2, if you sit here and think and plan and write lists, he's like, that's normal. I was like,
oh,
why didn't anyone tell me that? Like, I thought I was the only one.
That's so funny. My first meditation teacher did not do any guided meditations. He gave Dharma talks, so you would pick up kind of like the instructions from that. But then when it was time to meditate, he would just ring the bell, and we would all sit completely still silently for 30 minutes, and then the bell would ring again. And so, you were on your own to like realize that, you have a busy mind, and that the process is about bringing your attention back to whatever the object of meditation is, the breath or the sensation. And that's like jumping in the deep end. So I relate to what you're saying about it's almost like a little unkind in a yin class to just drop people into a pose and not give them, some form of anchor or some form of reassurance that a busy mind is a totally normal aspect of being a human person practicing yin yoga.
And that I think that one of the benefits of a yin practice is that it gives people an opportunity to notice some of that in hopefully a safe way.
Yeah. And like a micro chunk, so that it isn't too overwhelming. And yeah, totally. I agree. Because you have such deep training in Chinese medicine, I would love to hear like a little bit about how you approach weaving that into your yin classes, and what role you think that has to play therapeutically, and kind of where you come from with that.
Well, I think for the most part, in my just like, because I teach 2 at this point, who knows what the situation will be by the time this airs, but at this point I teach 2 drop-in yin classes. And so I think in a drop-in yin class, those are in person. You can only go so deep, because every time there's potentially people that are brand new to yin. So I feel like it's more important to have that new to yin speech than it is
like, what did I get myself into?
Right, into some esoteric Chinese medicine meridian theory, because they first just need to know their mind's going to be busy, and it's okay, when I get the opportunity to teach, and then in my Zoom classes, those are registered semesters, so they're 12 weeks long, so there's much more opportunity for me to dive a little bit deeper. I will say that one of the I don't know if this quote, where this quote came from, but that a little bit of information is a dangerous thing. So I
Yeah.
see this a lot in yoga circles where, and even with students that I've mentored, where I see them in a Facebook group saying something and I have to like private message them and be like, no, that's not the case. I think sometimes it happens with chakras. When teachers first discover chakras, they're like analyzing everybody's chakras, including their own. And that can happen with TCM as well. So I'm very wise to stay in my scope of practice.
Yeah.
So yes, I studied Chinese medicine for 2.5 to 3 years, but I'm not a Chinese medicine doctor, nor am I an acupuncturist. So I can work in consort with them. So for example, if they refer me a private client and I know their diagnosis, if they're willing to share that with me, like if the student or the client has given us the ability to share files, I can see what their diagnosis is. So that could inform what practice I create for them. But what I think we need to be careful of is I'll often hear teachers say, oh, well, my student is grieving. So grief is attached to the lung meridian. It's the emotion of the lung meridian. So we should do a bunch of things that open up the lung meridian. That's actually pretty irresponsible. Because first of all, it's overly simplistic.
Yeah.
And, it doesn't really, you're not really coming at it from a therapeutic brain either, because grief has its own, for example, its own timeline.
Yeah.
We can't give someone a bunch of things to open up the lung meridian and think it's going to fix their grief. That is not going to happen.
Right.
And so I see this a lot where people in yin trainings hear a little bit about meridians or the emotions attached to them. And then they're sort of like creating classes with that as a theme. I see a lot, for example, like here's a sequence for the kidney bladder meridians. But then if I were to ask them, okay, but why would somebody want to do that? Like, what about the kidneys and the bladder were you trying to access? Like, I mean, if you're doing a class from a seasonal perspective, that can be really helpful. But oftentimes I find that people pull these things out of their back pocket just to be like, look at what I can do, or look at what I learned, without actually doing any deep study. So I would say that if you're trying to teach classes from a meridian perspective, maybe don't, unless you've done some deeper study, because you're really not doing what you think you are. First of all, the meridians themselves are actually deeper from what we understand. Of course, we can't see meridians under a microscope. So this is Chinese medicine theory. Let's just say that it's not backed by science, but eventually science catches up to these wise old traditions, right? So the meridian itself is said to be deeper than what is in Chinese medicine, they call the sinew channels. The sinew channels are like fascia channels that correspond to each meridian, but don't always follow exactly the same pathway. Sometimes they are pretty much exactly the same pathway. Sometimes it stops partway through. So for example, the liver meridian itself, the energetic meridian, actually ends up on the torso, but the liver meridian's sinew channel does not.
Oh, interesting.
Yes, it follows most of the pathway, but then stops. So in a yin practice, actually what we're accessing is the sinew channels as opposed to the meridians. Meridians are, of course, they're interconnected. So of course, anytime I stretch my arm, I'm going to be accessing a meridian, obviously.
There's several of them in the area, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So anytime I stretch my arm, I'm not going to isolate one meridian, first of all, and I'll be moving my meridians, but I'll be accessing my meridians when I do qigong as well. I think what can happen, or yoga, for example, or movement-based yoga, I think what can happen sometimes is people learn about the meridians in their teacher training and they get like a very surface level understanding. And then they start to use them prescriptively. Yeah. And they start to think that when I bend forward in butterfly, I am actually stimulating my bladder meridian and my kidney meridian. And it's not quite that simple. You are definitely accessing the sinew channels. Yeah. And the meridian itself is usually accessed through needling or acupressure. So finding specific points. I've noticed that there aren't a lot of teacher trainings that talk about the sinew channels.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's because they are very much TCM, like, or, Chinese medicine. And so, like, unless you have trained with a teacher who is a Chinese medicine practitioner who has studied them deeply, they probably aren't even aware of them.
Right.
They're in the textbooks for sure. When you go to Chinese medicine, if somebody really wants to nerd out on them, Manual of Acupuncture by Peter Dedman is a good source, but don't buy the textbook. It's like the size of
It's like
5 novels. Yeah, you can get the app, and you can see
cool.
where the meridians are. You can see the sinew channels. So really, in a yin practice, what we're accessing is the sinew channel, and perhaps thereby the meridian itself. Maybe not.
This is really helpful to think about because, like, I always tell people, like, if you want something precise, go to an acupuncturist because there are hundreds of points that all have different properties, and you need someone who understands how all the different points interact with each other. And it's like, it might sound like you have a liver thing, but it might be how, kidney and liver are interacting, or the fire element, or the dampness, or it's super complex. And what we do in yin yoga, I think of, it's more just like creating conditions for harmonious chi flow. So it's just more general. And we, maybe are affecting the sinew channels and the way that chi can flow through them, but it's more of a wellness practice, and it's not like that super prescriptive where we can be so precise like an acupuncturist could be.
This is what I meant by a small amount of information could be a dangerous thing,
Yeah.
because teachers will often start prescribing poses based on a Chinese medicine theory, but they're not qualified actually to diagnose. Like you said, in Chinese medicine, they talk a lot about the branch and the root. So when someone comes in with back pain, for example, is a common example. Yes, you're going to treat the branch. You are going to treat the symptoms of pain, but you also need to go back and figure out, okay, what is the root of that? And maybe it's an injury, or maybe it's their kidneys, or, who knows? My point being that is something that a qualified acupuncturist or Chinese medicine doctor can diagnose. We can't dabble in Chinese medicine diagnosis.
Right.
If you haven't been trained in it, don't do it. And so I think for my own practice, if an acupuncturist has referred somebody to me, because I have taken Chinese medicine diagnosis and things like that, and I have access to their chart, I can create a sequence that can support what the acupuncturist or the TCM doctor is doing. But it's a support, not a fix.
Yeah.
And if I'm just working with the general public, I can't use that as a diagnosis. So I tend to lean on, even though I have all this wonderful Chinese medicine information, I tend to lean more on sort of the anatomical when I'm gearing my practices. I will do seasonal practices, so we may do, in the spring we do the wood element, but there's always an element of earth that comes into each. That's another thing that, if you haven't studied Chinese medicine and you take a 50-hour training and you learn like briefly about the seasons, you'll see teachers doing like poses, for example, just for the wood or just for the water. Well, first of all, you can't disconnect that because the meridians are all so close together that you're not just doing water. Yeah.
You cannot stretch your inner thigh and not have more than one, or you cannot stretch your chest and have only the lung. It's like heart's there,
and then on top
there.
of that, in early Taoist thought, the earth was actually the center. And all of the seasons would pass through the earth for 18 days on their transition. So the earth is responsible for transitions, and it's responsible for our ground and our center. So even if you were doing a practice, for example, for the fire meridians or for summer, you would still want a healthy dose of earth in there as well. And this is the kind of thing that, again, unless you've studied these things in depth, you're probably not going to do. Just like I said, when teachers are just introduced to the chakras through books or through their 200-hour, and all of a sudden they're teaching everything chakras without any deep study, it's kind of the same thing. It's like, it's a little information it's designed to get you curious for deeper study, maybe mentorship, with somebody, or go study Chinese medicine if you super love it, but yeah, it can be irresponsible. So what I tend to use that information for is I do seasonal practices. I use it when I work one-on-one with people. Especially if I've been referred to by an acupuncturist, then I definitely I can do a sequence up that will support the work they're doing with their Chinese medicine practitioner, but I don't diagnose these things.
Yeah. Wise. Very wise. I think sometimes we get excited about things like the chakras and the properties of the meridians because it gives us a language for talking about the psychological and mental and emotional aspects of practice that we know are there with us on the mat. But sometimes we don't distinguish between when we're speaking in metaphor and when we're doing something really literal, And I think that's where we get into weird things, like where we get these kind of sayings like, oh, all the emotions are in your hips, or you need to do a whole bunch of heart openers, or
insert big eye roll again.
Eye roll. So it just gets really oversimplified, right?
Yeah. And I've seen it in groups where people are like, oh, I'm working one-on-one with somebody and they were really angry today, so I did some poses for the liver meridian. I'm like, they were angry today. Like today. This isn't like a deep-seated pattern of like liver qi stagnation. This is like right before they arrived, somebody cut them off in traffic and almost killed them. Like, this is not, and so I just would caution teachers too. It's lovely to do. I think seasonal classes are nice. Just please make sure there's also an element of earth in whatever other meridians you're doing. But really trying to say, I'm doing this practice for blank meridian, and blank meridian is not accurate. It just becomes buzzwords at that point. And stuff to think that, like, you think it makes you look really smart and like, your stuff, but it's not actually accurate,
Right. Yeah, that makes so much sense. And that's really helpful, I think, to kind of make some of those delineations and to just kind of hold these things a little less literally, unless we really have deep, deep, deep training on them and really know what we're talking about. And even then, there's a level of uncertainty when, you're trying to teach it to a group and you really don't know, like, person by person, how this all shakes out. So
and I think people could use some of that information in tandem with an acupuncturist. I'm thinking more privately, like if you do love this and you want to learn more, if you team up, if you're a fairly experienced teacher and you want to team up with an acupuncturist and cross refer, it can be helpful then. But again, it's going to require a deeper level of study than probably what you get in your introduction to meridians in a 50-hour, because that's all they are, is super introductory. It's like, here is this meridian, here's where it goes. That's kind of what most people get, And
it's good to know, like, we need that to be part of our training because it is part of Chinese medicine and Taoism and Yin Yoga. If you practice Qigong, you'll hear about these things and, how the movements might affect the Qi flow. And so it's there, but it doesn't make us experts on it necessarily. So thank you for that. So what else, is there anything else you want to add? Any last thoughts about what might make a yin practice therapeutic? What have we not covered?
So I think a very good understanding of skeletal variation has to be the foundation, because if you as a yin teacher haven't really understood that, like all bodies are going to look different in these poses, then you can't meet people where they are.
Right.
So that, I would say, is the foundation. So Paul is the foundation. And then from there, for me, and I, the last time that I studied with Paul, I did have a chat with him because I had just started my yoga therapy training, or maybe it was halfway through, somewhere around there. And I just said to him, I'm noticing things that are common in the yin world that aren't sitting quite right with me, based on this new knowledge. So for example, language. There's some commonly used language in yin, which can be problematic. And so I just talked about it with him. And, Paul is the most humble person. I mean, it's amazing for someone who has such a wealth of information, the amount of humility he has. Like, that should inspire all teachers to still be always a student and humble. And one of the things he said, the first thing he said when I started bringing up certain words and, how I was feeling like, maybe not such a good idea for certain populations, or maybe didn't invoke what it actually felt like for me and for my students. He just looked at me and said, well, you should use whatever language works for you and your students. Like, just so matter of factly, that's Paul, right?
He's
just
so
like,
open like that.
Yeah. He's just like, well, of course, if you don't find that this language is working, like, these are just words, use your own words. And so I started replacing a lot of the kind of common ones. Like, I don't use the word edge.
I was going to ask you if it was edge.
Edge. I don't use rebound. I don't use
rebound.
I don't use the word discomfort ever, because a lot of people, especially in a therapeutic setting, the line between pain and discomfort is very unclear to them.
Yeah.
And if they're an A-type personality, they will push right through discomfort into pain. So I don't use discomfort as a gauge. I also don't say come to 70%, which is what most people do.
I say 40.
I say 50 to 60. Because what I've found is that if someone's an A-type personality and they're new to yin and they're still in that efforting, striving, pushing, white knuckling it, and you say 70, they're going to do 100.
170.
But if you back that off and then watch your room and also notice if people are still overdoing, that allows to me people to be in a place where they can really experience sensation without pushing, because it may let you in deeper over time, and it may not, right? This is one of the things I love the most about yin is there's no goal pose that you put on your vision board, right? when you understand that actually I'm only going to go as far as my bone structure will allow if I want to have healthy bones. It takes this sort of like competing and striving and efforting out. So I changed some language. So I don't use the word edge. I say sensation. And the reason I say sensation is because not everyone's going to feel stretch.
Right.
Sometimes you're feeling stretch. Sometimes you're feeling compression, maybe in a mindful way. Sometimes you're feeling it in a not mindful way and you need to back off a bit. Sometimes especially in those students that tend to be more open or have been practicing a long time, they may not feel stretch, but they can still feel something. They can feel chi in their body. They can feel the air on their skin. They can feel, there's so much to notice.
Yeah.
So that's why I use sensation, because it's open.
Yep. And more neutral.
Yeah. And I don't use the word edge. I don't use the word discomfort. Those have both been replaced with 50 to 60% and sensation. I also don't use the word rebound. I don't feel, to me, like it's not that it was sort of triggering in any way, but it just doesn't feel accurate as far as what I feel. So I tend to use the word resonance or
resonance.
Linger.
Yeah.
To me, when they come out, there's like a resonance of the pose still in your body. Or a linger. Linger is another one that I've come up with. Feel the linger of the pose.
I love that.
I have heard another teacher say echo, which I quite like as well.
Yeah.
So for me, and I remember I don't remember which DVD it's in. It might be in his anatomy DVD. There's a point where it's one of the little extras where Paul says, at a point, if you don't learn from your teachers and then sort of like develop your own thought process and kind of like outgrow them and do your own thing, then you're not really learning. I'm paraphrasing terribly. So if anyone has the DVD, you can check out that. It's in the extras. And this truly is his attitude. He is not at all attached. This is why he has not trademarked. Yes, this is why he's not trademarked Yin Yoga. So when students, for example, of his, like myself and other senior students of his, started adding in poses for the upper body, you didn't see Paul get all up in arms and say, that's not yin. He just was like, oh, well, if your students can benefit from that, then
Great.
absolutely.
Yeah.
When I asked him and Susie why they didn't have more for the upper body in my last training, they got so many questions from me last time. It was awesome. They just basically said, well, in our own bodies, it wasn't needed. But if your students need that, I was like, well, you clearly have not been working at a desk on a computer for many years.
Oh my gosh.
So, but if it'll benefit your students, you should absolutely do that. So they're very open.
That's so refreshing.
And so refreshing.
Yeah, I love that.
So those are a few of the things that make, in my opinion, that switched my yin to being therapeutic yin.
Yeah.
And then also a really big focus on the nervous system. So I do a probably 8-minute guided mindfulness experience. It also pulls them through the koshas if you want to pull in that aspect as well, with them lying in constructive rest at the start of class, because that pose is such magic for the nervous system. And then giving them the ability to drop in. So starting with the very external as far as like sounds and air on their skin, and then eventually pulling them into interoception. And I do all of that before we even start.
Yeah.
And then I just feel like people are so much more anchored in the moment. They're so much more aware of their body, and they're so much calmer already before we even start doing the poses. So those are a few of the shifts that I've made. And then of course I'm a prop queen. That goes back to my, so like I can prop like nothing. Yeah. Anytime I don't know how many pictures I have saved on my computer where I see someone using props in a cool way I wouldn't have thought of. And I'm like, that's awesome. Got to practice that. So I would say that those are the things that make it therapeutic. I also think that there is trauma, that can come up in any yoga class. But I think even more sometimes in yin, because there is so much still and quiet and being present. And if you are following the trauma center's definition, because they have trademarked the term trauma sensitive, another eye roll. So they've trademarked the term trauma sensitive. So you can't actually say that your class is a trauma sensitive class without being at risk, unless you've studied with them and have their logo on your website.
Didn't know that.
I know, right? And based on their definition, yin is not a trauma sensitive form of yoga. Neither is restorative or yoga nidra or anything where you're still and quiet.
That's so interesting.
So what we can do, I know when I started studying this in my yoga therapy, I was having a small mental breakdown because I was like,
this is what I do and it benefits my students.
I love yin and what am I going to do? So that doesn't mean you can't make your yin classes trauma informed.
Yeah.
So there are things that you can do to make your classes more trauma informed. And then also getting a good trauma training allows you to see when it comes up in the room that that's what it is. Some of the things that I have seen come up in a yin class, if I didn't have a trauma training, I probably would have freaked right out as the teacher, because I would have just been like, what is going on over there exactly?
Yeah.
So there's so many things that I learned about how trauma can appear in your class that helped me to be able to first of all, know that's what's happening in the room, to be like, oh, okay, I see what's going on here. And to be able to hold space for that. And then also how to help that student in a way that doesn't pull attention to them and also is beyond my scope of practice. And that's something that I go over in quite a bit of detail in my gym training. I don't teach how to be, I don't teach a whole module on being trauma informed, because that's not my specialty. Or being trauma sensitive. But what I do is I say, okay, here's how we can make yin classes more trauma informed. Here's what might come up. Here's what we can do about it and what maybe we shouldn't do.
Yeah. It should be a baseline of knowledge for anyone who's teaching it, whether they want to specialize in trauma informed practices or not. It's just, let's human beings coming to yoga class.
Yeah, I agree. And I do think that more and more 200s are starting to include modules, on it. But I think that any teacher, if you didn't have it in your training, find a good trauma training and just take it. It doesn't mean
Yeah.
that you have to only teach trauma sensitive yoga, because I don't. But I teach therapeutically, and so it really informs all of my other classes.
Yeah.
Why I use the word trauma informed, and just gave me the confidence and the skill level to be able to understand what is happening and what I can and can't do.
Yeah.
When it shows up in the classroom, because it'll show up. We're all just walking around with our wounds. It's impossible.
It's impossible.
Yeah.
We're humans. Yeah, I had a conversation on the podcast, one of our earlier episodes, with Julie Johnson about trauma informed yin, because she was also taking some therapeutic training, and the trainer informed her that yin yoga couldn't be trauma informed, and she was like, what, and I think it's interesting because there are many of us who've had trauma experiences and have found yin to be a refuge and a place of self-healing. So it's more about how we can create that environment, whatever the practice is, and many of the things you touched on, like meeting ourselves where we are with the props, use of language, creating an environment in general that feels safe and grounded. And that's all part of it, whatever the practice is, not leaving people hanging in the silence, all of these things we've been discussing.
Yeah. And I would say it's unfortunate that teacher said that to her, because yes, yin can't be trauma sensitive as defined by the trauma center's definition of trauma sensitive, because that's heavily trademarked and has a specific protocol.
Yeah.
But say that it can't be trauma informed. Any style of yoga can be trauma informed.
Right.
Yeah, because
right.
it's a way of setting up the room. It's a way of the way you speak and the space that you hold. And I mean, there's just I could go into it forever, but that would be a whole other episode. There's just so many little things that you have control over that you can set the stage for to make your classes more trauma informed, whether it's yin or restorative or hatha or vinyasa or whatever the case may be.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think definitely the word trauma sensitive, we want to watch using that because it's trademarked. But trauma informed, absolutely, yin can be. And from my experience working one-on-one with students, I've had students that have come to me specifically for yin, who privately or in classes, where very quickly I can see that they're working through some stuff. And if you are at the point in your trauma journey where you either are not aware of your trauma, so it's very unconscious, like you're not walking in the room saying, I'm a trauma survivor, right? It's very beneath the surface. That can be hard. That can be really hard. But there's a point often in people's trauma journey, if they're working with a therapist, where they are slowly actually trying to revisit their triggers and then go away and then come back to it and pull away, so that they sort of are increasing the feeling of safety with whatever it is. I worked with somebody, for example, who she had lots of different traumatic incidents, but one was a car accident. And one of the things that her therapist had her doing was, driving kind of like 3 blocks away from where it was, and then going home. And then weeks later, 2 blocks away, and then eventually driving down that street. So if somebody's in that place in their trauma journey where they're actively working with somebody, actually, from my experience working with students privately and in classes, yin can be super helpful there, because they can come right up to sort of approaching, and then they can pull away, and they have agency the whole time over how much they do and when they come out. And if the teacher is skillful at holding space for that, I actually think in those circumstances, yin is very therapeutic.
It's like a way of learning the language, learning the skill in a different context, where maybe we're doing it with sensation. Maybe we're approaching a little more intensity and then we're backing off, and we're learning how to pendulate in that way, so we can do that in other contexts. And it can be a really great place to learn that practice. It's like that's why we don't say just go to your edge, because it's not about just marinating on our edge all the time, right? It's about how do we dance with the intensity? What is our relationship to that intensity?
And coming into a position where they're starting to feel that trigger, if they're working with somebody, again, this is all with the help of a mental health professional, but coming to a place, maybe even with an area of their body or whatever it is, where maybe they're approaching that place where they're triggered, but knowing that they're in a safe environment, so that if they are triggered, like they can work through it, they can breathe through it. And so in that sense, it can be very therapeutic, with the caveat that I think that the person has to already be working in these areas with a mental health professional, right? We're not going to take somebody who is totally unconscious about any trauma they have, and they haven't even identified they have it. They're not working with somebody. That's a very different experience than somebody who has the knowledge and the skills and the support to work through it in that environment.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for this conversation, Nyk. You've given us a lot. We've covered a lot of ground, and I'm really appreciative of, all that you've shared. And if you would tell us where people can find you and follow you and learn more about your work, we would love that.
Okay. So if you just go to my website, Nyk Danu, so it's NYKDANU.com. From there, there's two buttons. One says teachers, one says students. So if you are a yoga teacher, you can click the teachers. If you're a student, you can click the student button, and that'll take you to sort of your portal on my website. I do Zoom classes for the public. I also do teacher trainings and in-person trainings, if anyone actually happens to be local listening to this. So that's where you can find me as far as my online home. I am on Facebook, but honestly don't love Facebook, so I don't spend much time there. I'm on Instagram at Nyk Danu Yoga. So if anyone's an Instagram fan, they can find me there.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you again so much. This has been really fun to go deep on these yin topics with someone who shares so much similar perspective, and I really enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you so much for chatting. I always love to meet other yin yoga teachers and therapists, yoga therapists, and nerd out about these things.
My pleasure. So that's today's episode. If you enjoyed this conversation, please share it with a friend or leave us a review on Apple Podcasts and help others find us that way. To learn more about my work, the Moved to Meditate class library, live online classes, teacher trainings, and private lessons, go to movedtomeditate.yoga. Thanks so much for listening.